Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling over gems of contemporary British political interest.
And before we get started this week, just a quick note to let you know that the Since Attlee Churchill podcast is now on YouTube. Now, whilst I totally resent the idea that I'm in any way behind the times, a mere 2 decades after YouTube was launched, I finally come to recognise that it's quite a big deal, and it's pretty useful for us to be there. So if you search Since Attlee Churchill on YouTube, you can subscribe to the page and watch video recordings of our latest podcasts. But Richard, why don't you get us started on this week's Matters of Interest?
My matter of interest this week comes from a piece that I wrote for Unheard called Political Resignations Are Becoming a Blood Sport. Now, this piece was initially motivated by the fact that the head of the Office for Budget Responsibility, Richard Hughes, had resigned this week over the early release of the OBR's analysis of the budget, which therefore inadvertently released the content of the budget before Rachel Reeves gave her speech. And also that Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader of the opposition, who we'll be talking about a little bit later on in this podcast, called for Rachel Reeves to resign and criticised her for using the head of this quango, the OBR, as Kemi Badenoch called it, a human shield. I think there's quite a lot we could say about that, the specifics of that. But I first just wanted to reflect on the general reasons why we'd expect a minister to resign and whether we are in today's politics a little too hasty to call for ministers' resignations. Since Labour came to office in July of 2024, there have been 2 or 3, depending on how you count it, cabinet members who have resigned. The Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, resigned over the failure to report youthful or younger year records of petty theft as part of the kind of pre-screening process to becoming a member of the government. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, resigned over her tax affairs relating to the purchase of a new house and not paying the full set of taxes on that. And the International Development Minister, Annalisa Dodds, who's not technically a cabinet minister but attended cabinet, resigned over appointed principle, which was cuts to her ministry, which I think is quite admirable. Now, in general, I think there are maybe at least 3 big reasons why a cabinet minister should resign. First of all, resignation is a really important part of the political constitution, Britain's constitution. It's an important aspect of ensuring that government is held to account and that also party government functions effectively. And so ministers are expected to maintain collective cabinet responsibility, and if they cannot do so, then they should resign. And that was the case of Annalisa Dodds. She couldn't support the policy of the government, so she left the government. That makes perfect sense to me. A second reason why a minister should resign is that ministers are also individually accountable for the good functioning of their departments. And if there is a major failure in their department, that ultimately the minister, the head of that department, Secretary of State, should resign. We saw, I think, an admirable example of this back in 2018 when Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, resigned over the Windrush scandal relating to the improper deportation of people who were legally here in Britain but didn't have the right paperwork, mostly from the Caribbean. And most of these decisions and that whole kind of fiasco actually predated her tenure as Home Secretary, but she was Home Secretary at the time when it came out, and she had to show that someone was taking political responsibility for that, and she resigned. And I think that was the right thing to do. I think the final big reason why someone should resign is if they're not up to the job and they just can't do the job effectively. Clement Attlee was absolutely merciless when he was prime minister in dismissing people who he thought were, in his words, just not up to it. And that was one of his sort of favorite explanations for why he removed people from government or why they were encouraged to resign. We saw actually a really interesting example of this in more recent times in 2002, when the Labour Education Secretary Estelle Morris resigned as Education Secretary, basically admitting that she felt she wasn't up to the job. She said, "I have not done the job as well as I should have done, and I do not think that I was giving the Prime Minister enough." And even though Tony Blair asked her to stay on, she just thought she was in over her head and she couldn't run a big government department like the Education Department. Now, in those three categories, I would have to say that the two cabinet ministers who have resigned, Louise Haigh and Angela Rayner, I don't think actually fall into those categories. I don't think there was anything in relating to those particular indiscretions that made them incapable of doing their jobs. And likewise with Rachel Reeves, I don't think that the OBR leak reaches the level of resignation. I don't see that as such a big systems failure that the Chancellor should resign. And so I think that actually, perhaps, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about this, Lee, because I'm not fully settled in my mind. I think perhaps we are a little too hasty when we are expecting ministers to resign in this day and age.
There's lots of interesting questions really about resignations and when should somebody resign or when should they offer to resign. I think in some ways that's worth setting out as a distinction. It's perfectly possible that somebody could offer to resign because there has been, say, some failure in their department, but that the Prime Minister would not accept their resignation. So one of the examples that springs to mind with that is when somebody broke into Buckingham Palace and entered the Queen's bedroom in the middle of the night, scenes which have been dramatised in The Crown, among other places. And Willie Whitelaw, the then Home Secretary, went to the Prime Minister and said, "Royal protection is within my bailiwick, so to speak, and I'm offering to resign." And Margaret Thatcher turned around and said, "Well, thank you very much, but no. You're too important to the government. There's important things that you're doing in the Home Office. This is not obviously a part of your ministerial brief where you have failed. Clearly there's been some security failing there, but it's not obvious that it's a matter of policy or a matter of direction from the minister themselves, or in this case, the Secretary of State, that has led to the failing." So I think that is an important thing to set out, that sometimes people could offer to resign on the grounds that they are not up to the job or there's been a failure in their department, but ultimately leave whether or not they continue in office up to the judgment of the Prime Minister.
But you want to be careful that the Prime Minister doesn't call your bluff. And here we have another example from Kemi Badenoch. He was really a very merciless manager. He had the sort of aura of I think, a very strict kind of, Edwardian businessman about him. So his parliamentary private secretary was a gentleman called Roland Moyle. Very interesting man. He was a working class background, was a bricklayer before he became an MP, and Attlee decided to put him in as his PPS. And after some time, he thought perhaps Moyle would like a ministerial role. And so he called in Moyle and said, "I'm minded to put you in this ministerial position." And Moyle said, with faux humility, "Oh, Prime Minister, I am not worthy." And Attlee said, "Oh, well, very well then. Good day," and withdrew the offer. So you've got to be careful there.
Gosh, that's Clement Attlee was still around, not a man to show false modesty to, in case he takes you up on it. The question of should somebody resign over failings within their department as well becomes a rather tricky issue as well. When I was a teenager, it used to be the case quite often in the news that you'd see some extraordinary story about, to make up an example, everybody's benefits records were somehow stored on one disk, And then by some remarkable turn of events, that disc ended up being left on a train somewhere. And there would be big questions about whether or not the political leadership of departments should resign over a blunder like that. So serious was it seen, thankfully, in this more cloud-based age. Either those things don't happen quite so much, or if they do, we don't find out about it because there's nothing physically on a train for somebody to discover. But in those sorts of cases, you would end up asking yourself, well, to what extent should a minister really be held responsible? And then there are the examples where we don't hold ministers responsible for things which are arguably within their remit. So if we take the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, let's imagine that next year the economy enters recession. Now that she has talked about growth, growth, growth as being some of her driving motivations for government. But let's say she fails to do that and the country does go into a recession, the economy shrinks, unemployment continues to go up. Should she resign for failing in her task to try and grow the British economy that she set out to do? Most people would actually say no. So this leaves me wondering really about whether or not the way we think about political leadership of departments and accountability and resignations in the right way, where somebody can be made to resign or prompted to resign over relatively junior mistakes that might take place in their department, but not over big questions about policy and about achieving those policies. That is fundamentally their bigger task.
Yeah, the example you gave about the loss of the data on child benefit recipients, I think it was in 2007. That's another similar sort of example to this situation about the OBR, because in the end, there was a resignation, but it was the head of HMRC rather than the Chancellor, Alistair Darling. And George Osborne, the shadow Chancellor at the time, called for Darling's resignation, or I think didn't quite call for Darling's resignation, but said that there were questions to be answered about his fitness for the role. But in the end, the head of this quango was the one that resigned. And we do have this sort of, I wrote in the Hannah Hurd piece, we live in this quagmire of quangos. It's difficult to find alliteration for Qs, but I think that one lends itself well to it. And that does mean sometimes that these bureaucrats end up taking a kind of form of quasi-political responsibility for what goes on in their arm's length detached government agency, which then provides a certain shield for the political principles, which I don't love as someone who doesn't really like quangocracy and does like the concentration of accountability in our system. But that is one way that this seems to have developed.
Again, on that point as well, I mean, the head of the OBR has now resigned. Richard Hughes has written to the Chancellor to say he will go over what is basically an admin error from somebody probably relatively junior. And then I find myself asking, well, the OBR successively over multiple years failed to appreciate that productivity was not growing in the economy in the way in which it forecast. Now, there's been these big debates about productivity growth in the UK, and the OBR would consistently say, we expect productivity to grow by X% in the years ahead. And then in reality, that wouldn't happen. And that has had a major impact on forecasting in the economy, because once you say there's going to be productivity growth and you build that into your expectations around business performance and tax receipts and the growth of the economy, then that has a major impact on what governments can spend and what governments expect the UK economy to look like. So a big failure like that, and I'm not necessarily saying he should resign over false prophecies. That would make anybody who works in economics shudder, because it's so hard to forecast what is going to happen in the economy. But a major mistake like that over multiple years that failed to appreciate what was really going on within the economy at the time didn't lead to a resignation, but a relatively junior admin error did. And what makes, of course, the admin error at the OBR all the more remarkable is that it didn't actually say anything that people didn't already know. It put some specifics onto the framework of a budget that had been briefed out already by the Treasury to journalists. Now, of course, there's a great debate about whether or not much of what journalists were told was accurate or not. But the big announcements, things like lifting the two-child benefit cap, but that was already in the newspapers. The specifics of how much the minimum wage was going to go up by. That was in the newspapers days before. So it is a remarkable series of events, really, where the head of the OBR has resigned over leaking something that people already knew was going to happen. That was done by somebody relatively junior within his organization. It doesn't really feel like it's actual accountability there for the performance of our institutions and the people who lead them, so much as a performative interpretation of accountability and resignation.
But I don't think we've ever held someone to the standard that they should resign because of political failure. Because actually, we need our politicians to be able to have the confidence to try new policy, to innovate, to take risks. Part of some of the problems, I think, in our sense of the British state at the moment is that we have an overly cautious public sector culture that has infected our politics as well. And if you go back and you think of, say, for me, the heyday of great government cabinets, when you think of the Wilson cabinets, for example, there were plenty of political failures there. You take, for example, Barbara Castle's attempts at trade union reform when she was employment secretary under Harold Wilson at the end of the 1960s. This was her in place of strife white paper that was intended to become a trade union reform bill, which it never did because there was upset in the Labour Party over that. It was very embarrassing for Castle, but Wilson didn't sack her over it. She didn't resign over it either. It was pretty hellish for her personally. You can see this in her diaries. It was a very, very difficult time for her. Or likewise, when Dennis Healey had to go to the IMF to get a bailout, this is when Jim Callaghan was Prime Minister. It's an admission of defeat in a certain respect. But there were probably calls for Healey to resign, but I think none that were particularly serious, and I don't think it was really something that Callaghan himself contemplated. Although in that case there was, and I think this is often this is the halfway house, is that when there is political failure, what you then might see is not a resignation or a sacking, but a subsequent reshuffle where someone moves along. And my understanding is in that case, Callaghan was planning to reshuffle Healey out of being Chancellor of the Exchequer and make him Foreign Secretary, and to do a swap with Anthony Crosland, who was Foreign Secretary, make him Chancellor. But then events intervened and Crosland died unexpectedly of a stroke. And he was replaced by a much younger Foreign Secretary, David Owen, who would not have been a suitable swap for the Chancellorship. So then Callaghan decided to keep Healey in place. I think, just on the sort of point about, what is the threshold for resignation? And I keep going back and forth in my mind about it. So I've just sort of defended people not resigning, and I've defended people being allowed to make mistakes. On the other hand, I do think sometimes when people resign, even if it's not something they've done directly, that's quite a good and refreshing thing. This example of the Richard Hughes at the OBR, or the example I gave earlier of Amber Rudd, because what I think it reminds us is that holding ministerial office is not an entitlement. It's an honor, and it's a duty, and people should feel a sense of honor when they really do feel that they've run out of road and are, in a sense, maintaining the dignity of the office by resigning. And if they can help to preserve the dignity of the office by going, then that may be a sensible thing. And so that may be, if we were to go back to the examples of Louise Haigh and Angela Rayner, where I said, to me, these were fairly trivial indiscretions. I know lots of more censorious people, I don't think that's necessarily our podcast listener, but maybe there are some who'd say, this is, these people are cheating. We have to hold them to account and so on. Fine. But maybe the fact of the perception of that sullies the office that they're holding, and therefore it is the right thing for the office for them to resign.
One of the things which I think has changed compared to when we were thinking about these issues historically is now the existence of the ministerial code. And certainly Keir Starmer has talked it up a great deal in terms of saying that ministers who break the ministerial code will be sacked or will be expected to resign. And certainly that was the basis on which, say, Angela Rayner ended up leaving government. It wasn't so much that HMRC were coming about to prosecute her and chuck her in jail. You know, there will be a penalty, it seems, for her to pay, and there will be additional tax for her to pay. But it's not as if there was a criminal proceeding against her or something that met a threshold where it would have been impossible for her to continue in office. But what she did break, apparently, was the ministerial code. But the ministerial code is also something which is really selectively applied. So in the ministerial code, it says that ministers are meant to make major policy announcements first and foremost to Parliament. And so when you get, as is obviously the case, political sign-off for leaks from the Treasury in advance of a budget in order to try and secure a longer period of positive headlines or to try and roll the pitch for a certain set of announcements that are coming in the budget, that is a breaking of the ministerial code. If the minister has in any way been connected to that or is in any way responsible for that. And I think we can all be pretty certain that they know it's happening and they give either a nod and a wink or they give their implicit blessing to that happening. If they didn't give their implicit blessing to those sorts of leaks happening, then they wouldn't happen because they'd either instruct the people who leak not to do it or they'd sack the people who leak for doing it. So the ministerial code really is broken all the time by the way in which the government operates. And these things either really matter, and the ministerial code is either the Bible for government ministers. Breaking it means that they ought to resign, or it doesn't. And the reality is that it's really selectively done.
Yes, in a book that I edited earlier this year called Strengthening the Political Constitution, which you have a chapter in, Lee, on the Conservatives and the Constitution, and I have a chapter about the political constitution. There's also a chapter called Conjuring the Constitution, written by Henry Hill, which is about the ministerial code. And just we didn't prepare this, but just on your point about the sort of sanctification of the ministerial code, Henry has this to say. He says, "I have called for the code to be scrapped, but failing that, the most sensible practical objective for those concerned to maintain as much as possible the political character of this aspect of government would be to deconsecrate the code, to make it just another boring bit of machinery of government, rather than the lodestar it is currently misunderstood or misrepresented to be." And then he suggests that one way to do this would be to break it up into many different documents and to give these documents very boring names, such as questions of procedure for ministers, and then not publish them anyway, which was actually, when the ministerial code was in its earlier iteration, it wasn't actually something that was published. It was just a sort of set of briefing notes for ministers as a kind of reference or guide for them, rather than this sense that this is, a code of laws. By calling it a ministerial code, it gives it this kind of Napoleonic character that one must abide by, or was it Hammurabi's code? And just on this point about leaks, a lot of journalists have got really upset over the idea that the Treasury has leaked out incorrect information and has, indicated for a period of time that they were going to raise income tax and then they didn't, and so on. And this has been cited by some of Rachel Reeves' critics, I think even by Kemi Badenoch, as another grounds for her resignation. I think that's ridiculous. I don't really care if journalists are given the wrong briefing. In fact, I think a rather canny politician might occasionally set the hairs running by giving a false briefing and put them on a false track. Is it the hares running, or is it the hounds running again after the hare? I've probably mixed that metaphor a bit. Harold Wilson used to do this all the time. Wilson was very paranoid about leaks, and he didn't trust journalists, and he didn't trust his own ministers, and probably didn't trust many of his own advisors. And so Wilson, canny and clever man that he was, would tell different versions of a story as a form of gossip to different people in his political circles. And then he would see which versions of his story ended up in the newspapers. And so he was deliberately telling false stories in order to get a sense of where the leaks were in government. Now, I know that's not why the Treasury did this. I mean, it sounds like it's possibly just actually due to more of incompetence than strategy. But I don't think there's anything sacred about the idea that briefings from ministers have to be truthful, and journalists just need to get over it.
Well, the suggestion, of course, is that it's tantamount to market manipulation, which would be rather more serious. A few final points before we move on, though. Firstly, on the ministerial code, I rather agree with Henry. One of the things that I really dislike about politics sometimes at the moment, and it's actually an issue with leadership in lots of organizations, not just political organizations, is that, let's say when Angela Rayner's scandal broke about stamp duty and the home that she was buying, fundamentally, whether or not that meets the threshold for leaving government is a question for the judgment of the Prime Minister. He is the person who appoints the cabinet or recommends to the monarch who should be appointed to the cabinet. It's his government. He is leading the government. And so whether or not Angela Rayner should be in that government really is up to him. And what I think is quite a cowardly and sort of administrative, bureaucratic, sort of tedious way of going about the business of government is to say, well, here is a code that for the most part somebody else has written. And I'm going to appoint somebody independently who's going to look at whether or not these events breach that code or not, as if this is a sacrosanct policy. And then on the outcome of that process, will I decide whether or not that person ought to remain in government. That is not really what I think the Prime Minister ought to be doing. Instead, I think the Prime Minister should have been thinking, for example, well, yes, she's done this thing that is wrong and she ought to apologise for that. But actually, what is the benefit of having Angela Rayner in government? What is the benefit of losing Angela Rayner from government potentially? What is the legislation that she's responsible for putting through? For example, the Employment Rights Bill, which has just been watered down and she is apparently quite annoyed about. There are all these wider considerations about her, about the direction of government, about the responsibilities that she had, which fundamentally can only be answered by a Prime Minister, because fundamentally he will be responsible when he leads his party into the next general election for whether or not they have delivered. And so I don't like this idea that that is farmed out to a bureaucrat effectively to decide whether or not a judgment that the Prime Minister should take should go in one way or the other.
Exactly. I think it's a totally overly rigid way of approaching these things. Before we finish this segment of the podcast, I just want to briefly mention the parallel example to budget leaks that many journalists have been talking about, which is the leaking of the 1947 Labour budget by the Chancellor Hugh Dalton. Now, the circumstances of that was Dalton was literally on his way to the House of Commons chamber when he bumped into his friend John Carville, who was a journalist at the Star. And unwisely, Dalton sort of spat out a staccato list of the big headlines of the budget that he was just about to deliver. And then Carville, having this wonderful scoop, rushed off to the papers and managed to get a breaking news report of the budget, which then started to circulate around Westminster at the time that Dalton was delivering his budget. So it is the kind of OBR leak of its time. But one of the things I think has been missed in the discussion of this was that although Dalton did resign the following day, so he gave the budget and then returned to Parliament the day after and gave his resignation statement, the leader of the opposition, Winston Churchill, did not call for him to resign. In fact, the opposite. So in the budget debate where this has come to light, Churchill says, "May I acknowledge on the part of the opposition the very frank manner in which the right honourable gentleman has expressed himself to the House," i.e. Dalton apologised for it, "and our sympathy with him at the misuse of his confidence which has occurred." And there was another MP who criticised this lobby correspondent for breaching, basically, the Chancellor's trust. And so it was seen that the dishonour was done by the journalist against the Chancellor rather than the Chancellor leaking to the journalist. Now, I have to say that Clement Attlee, and again, it's a common refrain of this episode, was not so forgiving about this. And when Attlee was told that Dalton did this, Attlee shouted, "What? A journalist? What is he thinking?" And he called Dalton a perfect ass. And Attlee did not want Dalton to stay in place. And so Dalton resigned the following day, and he was replaced by Stafford Cripps as Attlee's second chancellor. But again, that goes to show you that actually the ultimate decision over these things is a question of political discretion for the prime minister. And to be honest, I think Attlee used to get fed up with Dalton, and it was, in a way, a convenient way of replacing his chancellor, who was of whom he was growing rather tired.
As I've heard James Heal, the deputy political editor of The Spectator, say, justice for Hugh Dalton. I think it's about time.
I'm on Clem's side. Lee, what's your matter of interest this week?
So this week, I wanted to talk about how the past 7 days or so have been the biggest and the most important of Kemi Badenoch's leadership of the Conservative Party. Now, there is the obvious way in which that is true. She's received a great deal of praise in the last week or so from quite a large part of the right for her response to the budget. Of course, it's one of those historic quirks of the House of Commons that whilst the Chancellor delivers the budget, the Leader of the Opposition makes the reply and not the Shadow Chancellor. But that's not the only way in which I think this has been a really important week for Kemi Badenoch, and I wanted to talk about a couple of those other ways. The first is that I think this is the week in which it was basically settled that the best terrain for the Conservative Party to fight on in the years ahead, and certainly at the next general election, is the economy. It wasn't always clear that that was the terrain in which the Tories would be fighting. For example, Kemi Badenoch, as a politician, really made her mark in the House of Commons and elsewhere for the views and positions that she adopted on cultural issues, including issues about race and about gender. And it was possible for a period of time that she would make that the hallmark of her leadership of the party. Similarly, you can't speak to anybody in the Conservative Party who doesn't think that the party's record on immigration was one of its great failings of the last 14 years or so, and that they need to really re-earn trust and regain credibility on the question of immigration, certainly with the challenge of reform, of course, coming from the party's right, and where reform have really planted themselves very comprehensively on the question of border control. So it wasn't always clear that the economy would be the battleground that the Tories would choose. But I think this week, given the way in which Kemi Badenoch managed to find a good, coherent critique of the budget quite quickly, in the words that she used in the House of Commons, to paraphrase them, this is a budget for Benefit Street, paid for by working people. I think given that the lift in the two-child benefit cap was basically the only really memorable announcement that came in the budget, that was a pretty good line of attack for Badenoch to adopt. And given that she's had lots of media interviews and given she's been quite well received in the past week or so, I think that has rather settled that question. It's also been confirmed, I think, by the fact that all of the attention in the last week or so on economic questions has had an impact on Reform's polling position. So after months and months of seemingly ever-improving Reform opinion poll numbers, those numbers have started to go in reverse this week. And that's not to say that is a new trend being set. That's not to say that Reform is over. Reform is still leading the opinion polls, leading the Conservatives and leading the Labour Party as well. But what seemed to be that growing confidence, almost cockiness of Reform, that they were on an unstoppable trajectory that ended in a majority government and number 10 Downing Street, is certainly begun to be unsettled this week. And people are talking again, I think, about Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party as still being not just viable, but competitive at the next general election. Huge amount to happen between now and then. A lot of things that still have to go right for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party, but certainly it's been a very good week for her.
A few points to pick up on, Lee, from that interesting opening. First of all, I'll say that as a general matter, I do think it's been a very good week for Kemi Badenoch, possibly the best of her year as leader of the Conservative Party. And it does go to show you something of the value of being the official opposition and having that institutionalized role as leader of the opposition, and how valuable that could be. I thought about this quite a bit when I co-wrote this book on the history of the Labour Party in opposition called Keeping the Red Flag Flying, and about how vital it was in the 1920s and 30s. After the 1922 election, that's the first election that Labour becomes the official opposition. And of course, since 1922, Labour has either been in government or has been the official opposition. And that's not a trivial point. It's absolutely essential that at various points in Labour's history where it did suffer very serious losses, for example, in 1931, that it still held on to that official opposition role, because it gives you those opportunities to respond to government in a sort of formalized manner or semi-formalized manner that smaller insurgent parties can't do. And even in this very pluralistic media environment, that can be very useful. The second thing I do agree with is that the issue of the economy is probably the smartest one for the Conservatives to hitch their wagon to. In political science, we have this, it's these sort of, what's a polite way of putting it, these highfalutin terms. And one of them is the term issue ownership. Which party is seen to be most closely associated with being a good manager of that issue? And for example, in the Labour Party, it's often said that Labour has had issue ownership over the NHS, or maybe education. The Conservatives have quite often, but not always, been seen to have issue ownership over the economy and immigration. And in the tail end of the Conservative government, most recent Conservative governments, the Conservative sort of ownership over the economy and immigration took a battering, particularly immigration, but also the economy with the Truss budget. And this has happened at various points in Conservative history in the past. For example, after Black Wednesday, which we've done an episode on, the Conservatives really kind of lost ownership over economic management. I think that it is more plausible that the Conservatives will regain, maybe not ownership, but will gain maybe greater dominance in the issue of the economy, whereas I think immigration is going to remain a very, very difficult one. And so from the perspective of the Conservative Party in opposition and trying to keep reform at bay, they really want to ensure that Labour gets immigration down and reduces the salience of the issue of immigration in the public mind, so that the next election is not fought on the economy, on immigration, but is fought on the economy. Where I will slightly disagree with you, though, is on your claim that Kemi Badenoch has put aside the kind of culture war issues. Because I would say that actually her most punchy parts of her budget speech were not actually really a great deal about economic policy, but were targeted at the person of the Chancellor herself. That's fair play. We have a rough and tumble political culture. I don't think that our ministers should be wrapped in cotton wool. And I don't want us to have the kind of bland, self-important form of political debate that you often see, say, in different parts of the continent, say in Germany or countries like that. But really, a lot of her sort of hardest hitting bits were about Rachel Reeves' earlier comments before the budget was released about how she had in effect kind of been victimized by being a woman chancellor, and that she was a victim of mansplaining, and that people didn't respect her because she was a woman. And Badenoch had these lines about how respect is earned. It's not something that's just given. They're not mansplaining to you. You just don't understand. And people aren't talking down to you because you're a woman. They're fed up with you because you're incompetent, right? Variations of that. I can't remember the exact lines, but things like that. And those seem to be the lines that really kind of landed the most and also got clipped and got, I think, wider public attention. So don't you think that this is a kind of variation of Badenoch's forte on culture war issues, moving away from issues of race now onto the terrain of gender?
Certainly, that was an important moment in the reply. And I'm pretty sure Kemi Badenoch would have been delighted when she saw the interview that Rachel Reeves gave, in which she accused people of mansplaining to her. Because Kemi Badenoch makes a really big pitch about not caring whether or not somebody is a man or a woman, what skin color they are, what sexuality they are, whatever, but simply about caring about whether they do a good job and the quality of them as a person and as a politician, and in this case, as a chancellor. So I think there was a useful way for Kemi Badenoch to merge both the economic debate and a part of arguments or a canon of arguments with which she is very comfortable into one pretty brutal and quite effective attack. Of course, it has led to lots of suggestions that Kemi Badenoch was too mean to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, something I think she has rebuffed quite successfully. Whether or not we think people are too mean or not critical enough towards other politicians is almost always seen through a partisan lens. I think it's a debate it's barely worth getting involved in. Very few people on the left, of course, thought it was too mean to portray Liz Truss as a lettuce. Very few people on the right think it's too mean what Kemi Badenoch said about Rachel Reeves. People just use the idea that, oh, this is not what politics should be about. We should be kinder and friendlier than this. We should be more serious than this, as really just a way to try and pick up a partisan rock and launch it at their opponents. It's not actually a serious comment, I think, and nor is it a sign, as some people occasionally suggest, that politics is becoming less gentle or friendlier or of less sort of weighty substance. Politics has always had, for centuries, really brutal attacks and lines of attack being used against the opponents. You can go back to sort of the early system of political parties in this country in the late 17th, early 18th century. George Owers's book, The Rage of Party, is a very good example of that. Well, has lots of very good examples of that. You can go back to Dennis Healey saying that being up against Geoffrey Howe was like being savaged by a dead sheep. Now, these are not sort of gentlemanly discourses that the people were engaged in the past. They were brutal parliamentary politics, and that's rather what the point has been. So I think the idea that it's too mean from Kemi Badenoch to really go after the Chancellor is misjudged and is a fairly pathetic response.
Can I ask you something, Lee? I was just thinking now, there's a decent chance that Keir Starmer does not lead Labour into the next election. I mean, I think there is also a decent chance he does, but I think there's a non-trivial chance that Labour does replace him before the election, although Labour is typically very bad at doing that. And there will be a lot of calls for Labour to replace him with a woman. Labour's also very bad at electing women leaders, so I wouldn't say that's bolted on either. Do you think that Kemi Badenoch would do better facing a female Labour leader? I just thought, I sort of feel that maybe the answer is yes. And I sort of thought that in the context of her, when she sort of squared up to Rachel Reeves about, let me talk to you woman to woman. And she just felt really at ease in that line, because she does have that critique that it's not just about race. And actually, I think it has a broader reach when she does it in gender, against a certain form of liberal feminism, which she has no truck with. And she has a kind of alternative, maybe more conservative form of, I don't know if she called herself a feminist, but, the idea that a woman is just as good as a man. Do you think that she would be more comfortable facing a female Labour leader? Do you or maybe not comfortable is the wrong word, but do you think that there are more opportunities for her to to shine if Labour elected a woman leader before the next election.
It's hard to know whether she would be better or worse in that context, but certainly one of the challenges for leaders of the opposition quite consistently over the years is to respond to different prime ministers. When we think about lots of the people who took parties into government, particularly from the Conservative side, Margaret Thatcher started out up against Harold Wilson in the House of Commons when she was leader of the opposition, and only then got Jim Callaghan, who she's much more famously remembered for going up against and ultimately defeating in 1979. Similarly, David Cameron started out as leader of the opposition against Tony Blair, and then ultimately had to stand opposite Gordon Brown and fight the election against him. So it's obviously not uncommon for leaders of the opposition to find that the person that they're up against changes mid-term, and inevitably that means they have to adapt to it. The final point I wanted to make about why this was a really important week for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives is that when you've been in government for 14 years, although it's worth saying that Kemi Badenoch's only been an MP since 2017, so she certainly wasn't in government for 14 years. But she leads a party, of course, that was either in coalition or in majority or in minority, and is very much seen as responsible for what happened between 2010 and 2014, the good, the bad, and the ugly. One of the challenges when you're in that position and then go into opposition is every time you say something, people can turn around and say, well, you had 14 years. Why didn't you do that? And it's rhetorically an incredibly effective rebuttal to anything that new oppositions who have recently been in government say. But when it comes to the two-child benefit cap and criticising the fact that Labour have now scrapped it, it's not something where people can turn around and say, well, you had 14 years, why didn't you do this? You're just throwing criticisms at a new government. Because, of course, when the Conservatives were in government, they did bring in the two-child benefit cap. And this is something that they did, which polls fairly well. We'll see whether that changes now that the policy is changing. That has been reversed by this Labour government. So it's not only seemingly a good battle for the Conservatives to take on in terms of how they position themselves for making arguments leading up to the next general election. It's also one of the few issues where they can really go after the government without simply being dismissed as having very recently been in office and not taking the chance to do something when they had that opportunity. That's all for this week's Midweek Matters of Interest. We'll be back on Sunday with our next substantive Since Attlee Churchill podcast. Just a quick reminder that if you enjoy listening to the podcast, we'd be really pleased if you left us a positive review wherever it is you get your podcasts from. And if you do have any questions that you want to send in or comments you want to send in to me or Richard, you can find our email addresses in the description of the podcast.
Thanks very much.